The House of Representatives has just approved a stopgap spending bill that would keep the federal government open. NBC News chief Capitol Hill correspondent Ryan Nobles joins us now. Tell us what you're seeing and what's happening up there and why this matters.
Well, Nicole, it is very important that this passed in the form and fashion that it passed, because it's now going to put Democrats in the United States Senate in a difficult position as to how they're going to handle the next stage of this negotiation. The bill ended up passing in the House by a very slim margin of 217 to 213, largely along partisan lines. There was one Republican, Tom Massie of Kentucky, who voted no, but there was also one Democrat, Jared Golden of Maine, who voted yes. Now it is going to be up to the Senate to decide with finality whether or not this stopgap spending bill is signed into law and is passed. Now, in order for it to pass in the Senate, it is going to need bipartisan support. There will need to be 60 votes for this to pass in the Senate. So that means at least 8 Democrats are going to have to join with Republicans in order to pass this legislation. And Democrats are going to have to make a decision here. They've been wrestling with this process for some time. This is one of the few opportunities they have, with the lack of power, the lack of control that they have in both the House and the Senate, to exert some level of defiance and some level of standing in the way of the Trump agenda. And one of the opportunities they have to do that is force some level of negotiation around this spending plan. What they did in this process was that they dared Republicans to pass this with only Republican support in the House. They thought a week ago that that was impossible. There is a significant group of House Republicans, conservative House Republicans, who almost never vote for what we call these continuing resolutions, which are basically funding packages that go outside the regular appropriations process, that buy time to allow the negotiations to go forward. It's something that Congress uses on a regular basis outside the regular appropriations process. So now Democrats have got to make a decision in the Senate. Do they use the leverage and the power that they have to try and force a round of negotiations with the Trump White House that could relate back to some of these DOGE cuts, that could relate to the way that Trump is handling the spending of government funds? Or do they not take that risk because it could lead to a government shutdown and instead vote to keep the government open and then live to fight another day? Right now, Democrats in the Senate are very split as to how to handle that. They wanted to see how this process would play out on the House side of things. They were very skeptical that Republicans could get this done in the House. And so now they're going to have a tough decision here over the next couple of days, with, of course, the funding deadline coming up on Friday, Nicole.
It started with a sort of mysterious notice this afternoon, a reference to security concerns that went out to all employees at the U.S. Department of Education. Quote, beginning today at 6 p.m., all Education Department offices will be closed for security reasons. Employees must vacate the building by that time. This notice also said all Education Department offices would be closed tomorrow and no employees would be allowed in. Now, this notice had no details about what these security reasons were, but it was pretty clear what was coming. After all, we've been through this a couple of times already now. It was just over a month ago when people who work at USAID got an email saying their office would be closed the next day and they shouldn't come to work. That was right before Trump set about completely dismantling that whole agency. Employees at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, same thing, sent a very similar note saying their office would be shut for the following week, just as the White House ordered the entire agency to stop all of its work. And sure enough, tonight, just after the 6 p.m. deadline for Education Department workers to vacate their offices because of some security concern, Trump Education Secretary, the billionaire pro wrestling executive Linda McMahon, announced that her department is cutting its workforce in half. They will begin firing more than 1,300 people from the Education Department tonight. And then, of course, she went straight to Fox News.
That was the president's mandate, this directive to me, clearly is to shut down the Department of Education, which we know we'll have to work with Congress, to get that accomplished. But what we did today was to take the first step of eliminating what I think is bureaucratic bloat. And that's not to say that a lot of the folks, it's a humanitarian thing, too. A lot of the folks that are there, they're out of a job. But we wanted to make sure that we kept all of the right people, the good people.
You know, if you find yourself starting to feel a little tug on your heartstrings for those 1,300 people who are out of a job tonight at the Education Department, don't worry. We kept all the good people. We kept all the good people. The 1,300 people who are getting fired tonight, they just aren't, they're not good. They're not good. Who is this for? The vast majority of the American people do not want this. A poll earlier this month, Reuters Ipsos, earlier this month found that fully 66% of Americans oppose abolishing the Education Department. Nearly half of Americans strongly oppose it, while only 16% are strongly in favor of it. This is not something Americans want, but Donald Trump is trying to do it anyway, apparently starting with firing fully half the people who work at that agency tonight. This is from NPR on the Trump administration's announcement tonight that they're firing 1,300 people from the U.S. Department of Education. Quote, AFGE, American Federation of Government Employees, Local 252, a union that represents Education Department employees, released a statement in which its president, Sharia Smith, said, "We will fight these draconian cuts." Minutes later, AFGE Local 252 told NPR that Sharia Smith was laid off, along with all 5 of the chapter's other union officers. Joining us now is Sharia Smith. She's president of the union representing 2,800 employees at the Education Department. She served our country as an attorney for the Education Department's Office for Civil Rights until this evening. Ms. Smith, thank you so much for being here on Tonight of All Nights. I am sorry for what you're going through.
Thank you so much, Rachel. My coworkers and I from all over the country really appreciate the platform you're giving us to talk about this.
Is it the case that your whole office is being closed and your colleagues, all of your colleagues at your office are being fired as well, the whole thing?
You know, that's so interesting that you asked the question about our whole office. So we've reviewed the list of people who are set to be laid off. And I also listened to Secretary McMahon's statement about how they're keeping the good people. The people that they seem to be keeping are white men who happen to have graduated from very conservative schools. Not to say that they're not good. I think all of my coworkers are excellent. Many of them are members. But the coworkers that are being laid off as well are also good. What is curious in the U.S. Department of Education is that the layoffs, the mass terminations, the administrative leaves are seeming to affect and impact disproportionately women and people of color. And the Department of Education should be a model employer. And I want American people to think about, do they want their employer to follow this model where the only people that are deemed good enough to keep their jobs and their ability to support their families are people who are from a certain race and are of a certain gender.
Mm. I know that this has all just happened in the last few hours, but with what they've been telegraphing about their plans for the Education Department, I know that you and your union colleagues and your colleagues at work more broadly have to have been expecting the worst. Do you believe that your union or that the employees more broadly have recourse to fight these firings and have recourse to fight their efforts to abolish the department?
Well, absolutely, because their efforts are illegal. Again, since the new administration came into office, we have experienced mass terminations and unchecked unprofessionalism, and people just not going by the rules. Even this layoff is not something that should have occurred. The layoff was not because of a budget shortfall. The president can't just lay people off because he does not agree with them or he does not like the color of their skin or their gender. So certainly we are availing ourselves for, of all recourse to challenge this and talking with attorneys, and we have been since the first round of layoffs on January 21st. And so, we'll be fighting, and we hope the American people will fight with us.
Linda McMahon, in explaining what she's doing here, has also said that the American people should expect that there will be no interruption to any of the programs that the Education Department administers. I have to ask you if that is possible with what they're planning tonight, with half the workforce gone overnight.
Absolutely not possible. Since January 21st, our entire agency has been interrupted. We've been told not to work. We've had people who have been forced from working, even though there have been high performers. There's no way, we were already understaffed. There is no way we can continue operations at the levels that we had been when you have half the workforce and you have fired great people. You have fired high performers. There's no way. If you believe that, I have a bridge to sell you in Brooklyn.
Sharia Smith is the president of the AFGE union that represents Education Department employees. She's an attorney for the Education Department's Office for Civil Rights. She was fired this evening, but as she says, she believes that she and her colleagues have absolute recourse to fight back against these firings as illegal. Ms. Smith, again, I am sorry for what you and your colleagues are going through tonight. Thank you for taking the time to talk us through it, and please stay in touch with us as this proceeds. I know this won't be the last we'll be hearing from you.
Thank you, Rachel.
All right. Good luck to you.
Tariffs are a tax hike on foreign countries that, again, have been ripping us off. Tariffs are a tax cut for the American people, and the president is a staunch advocate of tax cuts. As you know, he campaigned on no taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime, no taxes on Social Security benefits. He is committed to all three of those things, and he expects Congress to pass them later this year.
I'm sorry, have you ever paid a tariff? Because I have. They don't get charged on foreign companies. They get charged on the importers.
And ultimately, when we have fair and balanced trade, which the American people have not seen in decades, as I said at the beginning, revenues will stay here, wages will go up, and our country will be made wealthy again. And I think it's insulting that you're trying to test my knowledge of economics and the decisions that this president has made. I'm now regret giving a question to the Associated Press.
I mean, she's awash in regret and remorse and offense, but she's either tragically uninformed or lying. There is no economist that's been tapped to sit in Donald Trump's cabinet who would testify under oath to what she just said. Quote, tariffs are a tax cut for the American people. Simply the opposite is reality. Why do you think they're on such a furious propaganda mission around the tariffs?
I think that Donald Trump has a very, very unusual, idiosyncratic, and completely incorrect understanding of how tariffs work. You can look at economists everywhere from the Libertarian Cato Institute to the left of center think tanks in Republican and Democratic administrations, aside from the Trump administration, and they all agree that tariffs function as tax increases on consumers. What happens with a tariff is that companies importing pay the cost of the tariff, and they mostly pass those costs on to consumers. You can go look at corporate earnings calls, and they all say that tariffs function this way. So, you know, I think that this comes from Trump himself, who has for decades now held this unusual understanding of tariffs, but it doesn't make it real. It doesn't make it true. And we already have companies saying that they will have no choice but to pass some of the cost increases on. And again, these are not companies that are heavily politically aligned. Some of the companies that have been most concerned about the tariffs are heavy industrial companies concerned about the cost of steel, aluminum, and other manufacturing inputs. So as much as Trump believes this, it's simply not true. And American consumers are finding that out right now.
Claire, there are some lies that they tell, the woman from the podium and Trump and Vance and others, that we deal with our own exasperation and consternation. We call it Earth 1 and Earth 2. But there are other lies they tell that they can't get away with because their own supporters, lived reality, defy the lie. So the price of eggs is up. People's retirement savings, if they're near retirement age, have cratered. People who derive anxiety or hope from the way the markets go are awash in anxiety, not hope. And Trump, if you compare Trump to Trump, Trump is way off the mark from where he was the first time around. He has cratered his own economy. Why?
I think he's got, obviously, a misplaced sense of his power. And frankly, I think he really has a misplaced sense of whether or not people respect him. You know, there's two ways to create fear in politics. One way to create fear is to gain the respect of both your allies and your adversaries. And you do that by strong, consistent leadership. The other way to create fear is through instability and chaos. And that's the fear he's creating. And what he's electing more progressive leaders across the globe right now than, frankly, ever would have happened without him. He is politically pushing people away from conservatism because they see it as now a Trump thing. I'm in Germany right now, and I can tell you the people I've interacted with in the short time I've been here, they are scratching their head. They do not understand what has happened in America. And I think at home, his base, he won the part of our economy that struggles the most. The paycheck to paycheck people are suffering, and he is not helping them. He is hurting them. That does not, on all these fronts, he is not going to gain ground politically, and he may not realize it now, but he will eventually.
Claire, the piece about annexing Canada, a friend and a neighbor who has never done anything to offend any American or any American politician, who has only helped us in national security crises and as an economic partner, trading and otherwise, contrasted with the things he said about Vladimir Putin, and I'll quote him. Quote, he and I have been through a lot together, end quote. You can't separate the two, right? It's not just the animosity for our closest friends on the world stage from a national security perspective and an economic one, but it is also the fawning, pandering, and affinity and affection for our greatest adversaries. What at this mark, 51 days, do you think explains that?
I think he sees power as his ultimate objective. He is not a student of the Constitution. He doesn't understand the value of checks and balances in our system. And he thinks executive orders is the way to make him an autocrat, like Putin, like Xi, like all of these guys that he is sucking up to, who don't allow their people to have a voice. I mean, the idea that he's trying to deport someone who is legally in this country because he disagrees with him. I mean, think about that for a minute. And think about the whole thing of saying he's going to make Canada the 51st state. What, is he going to go to war with Canada? Does he think the American people are going to put up with us losing lives to try to take Canada? Because Canada is not going to do it ever willingly. So the only way you do it is by force. Is he going to do to Canada what Putin has done to Ukraine? I mean, that's the logical consequence of what he's saying. And it's batshit crazy. Sorry.
It's okay. It's 4:17. Someone had to say it. Amanda, I guess I'll give you the last word.
It's 9 o'clock in Munich, so I've got an excuse.
It's always 9 o'clock
at night.
It's always 9 o'clock somewhere. You can always say it here. If Bill Barr can say it, the seal has been broken. I mean, Amanda, I'll come back to you. Are Canadians prepared for that possibility? What Claire just articulated is the natural extension of demanding the annexation of another nation.
I will tell you that Canadians are pretty firmly opposed to any such plan. And I don't even want to give it enough credibility to say what Canadians would do, myself included, if it came to that. But let's just assume we don't have to, that there's all kinds of checks and balances standing between us and that worst outcome. In the meantime, a lot of damage can be done. And just as, your tariffs are paid by your citizens and businesses, our counter tariffs are paid by ours. So the economic damage is real. It's already happening. And the uncertainty for business is already doing untold damage. We now have a risk of recession on both sides of the border that we didn't have 6 months ago. And so whatever the outcome on that front, the economic damage is very real. As for the rest of it, I'm just going to continue to hope that cooler heads prevail and we don't actually wind up in the kind of situation that is that worst case scenario.
On Friday, the Department of Justice pardon attorney, that's the senior government lawyer in charge of evaluating and processing petitions to be pardoned, was fired. Hardly any notice. First glance, it looked like there was probably a story there, and sure enough, there was. Here's the headline. DOJ official says she was fired after opposing the restoration of Mel Gibson's gun rights. The pardon attorney, Liz Oyer, said she was told, quote, Mel Gibson is a friend of the president, and that should be justification enough to restore his gun rights. When she didn't go along with the recommendation, she was fired. And joining me now is the former Department of Justice pardon attorney, Liz Oyer. Ms. Oyer, thank you very much for joining us. First, can I just ask you for people that have no idea what a pardon attorney is, can you just explain what your job was?
Yeah, absolutely. So it is a little understood position. The job of the pardon attorney is to make recommendations to the president about granting clemency to people who are deserving of second chances. And I know that we hear about pardons in the news, and they're usually the high-profile ones and the controversial ones. Those are not the cases that I work on as the pardon attorney. The job of the pardon attorney is to ensure that all of those Americans who don't have access to the White House through the front door still have the opportunity to be considered in the clemency process. So that's my job, to make sure that those deserving Americans who don't have political access, don't have connections, aren't celebrities or wealthy, can still have access to the justice that clemency can provide.
And how long had you been doing that job?
I had that job for nearly 3 years. It would have been 3 years in April.
Now, tell me about what happened last week. When did the Mel Gibson issue first make its way to you?
I was tasked a few weeks ago with joining a working group in the department that brought together multiple offices within the Department of Justice in order to launch a process to broadly begin restoring gun rights to Americans who had lost their rights to possess a firearm because of a criminal conviction. This is a project that I understood was a priority for the Attorney General, and I was told that this project was going to be centered in the Office of the Pardon Attorney, which was an entirely new workflow for us, not something that we had ever done before.
And was it like just a bunch of people in a spreadsheet, or was it like, hey, here's Mel Gibson?
So I was told that we were working toward establishing a process that all Americans who were prohibited from possessing a firearm would have access to. And the initial request of my office was that we identify a group of candidates who we thought would be suitable for the Attorney General to grant this relief to in connection with making an announcement of the broader program. So what I did when given that assignment is I looked to the pool of individuals who had applied for presidential pardons and who my office had vetted for consideration of a presidential pardon. We extensively vet people before recommending them to the president for a pardon because we know that one consequence of receiving a pardon is that you're able to legally purchase a firearm. So when we vet someone for a pardon, we conduct a full background investigation of the level that would be required to gain a top secret security clearance.
Was Mel Gibson one of those people that you had identified?
He was not. Mel Gibson has never applied for any type of relief through my office, but we were able to identify 95 ordinary Americans who had applied for pardons, who had been waiting years to be considered for that relief, and who have been extensively vetted. All of these folks had in common a number of things, including that their underlying crimes of conviction were nonviolent offenses. They were minor offenses. They were offenses that happened many, many years ago, in all cases 20 plus years ago. And these are all individuals who had demonstrated by interviews with neighbors and employers and family members and others who know them that they have been outstanding citizens since the time of their conviction. Mel Gibson was not among those individuals who we identified.
So how does Mel Gibson enter the workflow?
So what happened was I was asked to put together a memo for the Attorney General summarizing the cases of 9 of the 95 individuals that my colleagues and I had identified. They had whittled that 95 down to 9, and they asked me to write a memo to the Attorney General recommending that these would be suitable candidates for her to grant this relief of restoring their firearm rights. And I was comfortable doing that with those cases because I had a great deal of information about those 9 people and had already recommended that they were suitable candidates for a presidential pardon. So Mel Gibson did not enter the equation until after I sent the initial draft of my memo to some officials within the Office of the Deputy Attorney General. They received my memo and they sent it back to me with the direction, please add Mel Gibson to this recommendation.
I see. And their justification for that was what?
Well, there was no justification specifically provided, but they did attach a letter that had been sent by Mel Gibson's personal attorney to the then acting attorney general and acting deputy attorney general, in which Mel Gibson's attorney requested that he receive this relief from the attorney general. Mel Gibson's attorney laid out that Mr. Gibson had a previous conviction for domestic violence in 2011 and that he had attempted to purchase a firearm in 2023 and that he was denied because of his criminal background. And the attorney stated that Mr. Gibson is a high-profile actor who's made lots of famous movies and that he has a relationship with the president, and asked that he be granted that relief.
Todd Blanche, who is the number 2, I guess, now at Department of Justice, has this to say about your account here, saying that former employees who violate their ethical duties by making false accusations on press tours will not be tolerated. I don't know what that means. This former employee's version of events is false. Her decisions to voice this erroneous accusation about her dismissal is in direct violation of her ethical duties as an attorney, is a shameful distraction from our critical mission to prosecute violent crime, enforce our nation's immigration laws, and make America safe again. What do you say to that?
Well, Chris, the reason that I'm here talking about this tonight is because what's going on inside the Department of Justice in terms of silencing dissent is so frightening that I felt like I needed to share this story after I was fired. And frankly, I think Mr. Blanche's statement really just proves my point. My ethical duty as a Department of Justice employee, and now a former one, is to the laws of the United States and the people that I was entrusted to serve. It is not to the bullies who are currently running the Department of Justice. We take an oath of office as Department of Justice employees, and that oath says nothing about loyalty to the political administration or to the political leadership of the department. And frankly, I think that the position that Mr. Blanche is taking in his statement really just proves how terrified we should be about the current situation at the Department of Justice.
All right, Liz Oyer, former pardon attorney at the Department of Justice, fired by the Attorney General, I guess, there for refusing to give Mel Gibson a pardon, sign off on one. Ms. Oyer, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Chris.
Joining us now is Doug Ford, the Premier of Canada's most populous territory, Ontario. And Premier Ford, as we mentioned, President Trump is now saying he is enacting a 50% tariff on steel and aluminum from Canada, which will go into effect tomorrow in response to your actions. What's your reaction?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. I start every interview with saying we love Americans. I love Americans, spent 20 years of my life there. And I know Canadians love Americans and vice versa. In saying that, we will not back down. We will be relentless. I apologize to the American people that President Trump decided to have an unprovoked attack on our country, on families, on jobs, and it's unacceptable. Let's work together. Let's get to the table if he has issues, and let's sort this out. You see the market tumbling. Consumer confidence is down. And if he continues on with this, assembly plants in Michigan will shut down and around the country, whoever makes autos, and as well as businesses. They're going to hurt. And these pensions, when the market goes down, it's going to affect people's pensions. So I'm not too sure why he continues to attack his closest friends and allies. But we need the American people to speak up. We need those CEOs to actually get a backbone and stand in front of them and tell them this is going to be a disaster. It's mass chaos right now. That's what we need.
Well, he'll have a chance to hear from those CEOs today, as we just mentioned. If you're talking de-escalation at this point, what would it take for you to remove that surcharge on the electricity coming into the U.S. from Canada?
Well, doubling the tariff on aluminum, that the U.S. only can manufacture 16% aluminum that they need. The balance, for the most part, comes from Quebec, over 65%. It's going to hurt your manufacturing. You need the aluminum. You need our high-grade nickel. And I want to send more high-grade nickel. You need our electricity. You need the 4.3 million barrels of oil that gets shipped down. I want to make sure we build an AMCAN fortress, the two greatest countries in the world. Fighting like this does not make sense. But I will respond appropriately on the electricity. Stay tuned.
So what does that look like? What are the potential responses?
Well, we'll see. I'll talk to the team and we'll make an appropriate response. to President Trump. Again, I stress, this is not the American people. Canadians know it. And if we go into a recession, it's self-made by one person. It's called President Trump's recession, which shouldn't be this way. We should be booming, both countries right now.
Have you and your team talked with President Trump or members of the White House since the beginning of all of the tariff back and forth, specifically since you had implemented this 25% surcharge on electricity coming into New York, Minnesota, and Michigan?
I've talked to the three governors. I've also talked to Secretary Lutnick and President Trump. You like the guy, you don't like him, they understand. They're business people. And for this to be unrolling and putting the whole country and Canada into a potential recession over what? He should be focusing on China. He should not be focusing on his closest neighbor and ally.
If you could talk to President Trump right now, what would you say?
Stop the chaos. It's hurting American families. It's hurting Canadian families. There's uncertainty, and the markets dislike uncertainty. So do business, so do investors, so do people. They want to know that they're going to have a job, and we're going to have a booming economy. He's done the total opposite. He ran on a mandate of creating jobs, lowering inflation, and it's backfired on him. And he has to step up and change course. Inflation is happening right across the country, and the unpredictability that he's put to the markets are speaking. People will be speaking, and businesses will be speaking as well.
President Trump has cited fentanyl crossing the border as a big reason for the tariffs. Of course, he's also repeatedly called for Canada to become America's 51st state. What's your sense of what this is really all about? Why do you think President Trump is doing this?
Well, he believes there's an unfair trade deal that he created. I remember his words, the greatest deal ever. I guess it's not the greatest deal to him anymore, but let's resolve it. Let's sit down across the table and let's work this out, because all it's going to do is hurt American families. It's going to hurt Canadian families. And it's not just American and Canadian. It's going to affect the whole world. Well, China is ramping up for the last 10 years, as we've all been sleeping. They're taking over the critical mineral sector in the entire world. But there's one area that has more critical minerals than anywhere in the world. That's Ontario. And I want to make sure it goes to our closest friends and allies and protect America and Canada.
You guys are going through a transition in leadership as well. You're about to have a new prime minister, Mark Carney. Yes. Have you spoken to him since he won? And where do you expect him to take this fight?
Well, I spoke to him yesterday. He's a very bright individual. He understands finances like no other person. And we need to sit down, which we will tomorrow. We're going to have breakfast tomorrow morning, and we'll have a strong strategy. He understands that it's not the American people. It's one person, and that's President Trump. Even Republicans I speak to behind closed doors, governors, senators, and congresswomen and men, every one of them, I've talked to a tremendous amount of them, said they totally disagree with this approach. Why attack your number one customer in the world? We buy more goods off the U.S. than any country in the entire world. We want to continue buying more goods. And our supply chains are so integrated. I always say, Anna, that you cannot unscramble an egg that's been around since the 1960s in the auto pack. You have to make a larger omelet. And there's an opportunity to bring companies from all over the world into the United States, into Canada, and produce more goods.
Ontario Premier Doug Ford, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate you joining us.
Anna, thank you so much. God bless America and God bless Canada. We'll get through this together. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was yet another day of tariff whiplash brought on by President Trump. It all started with a Truth Social post by the president escalating his trade war with Canada. Trump threatened to double tariffs on steel and aluminum imports after the Ontario Premier put a retaliatory surcharge on electricity used by more than 1 million Americans. The president also suggested, again, that the only solution was for Canada to become America's 51st state. Well, those comments roiled the stock market for a second day in a row, causing mass chaos, only for Trump to walk back his threat hours later, saying he'd probably reconsider his decision after the Ontario Premier agreed to suspend that surcharge and meet with Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick later this week. My panel is back with me, Catherine Rampell, Eugene Daniels, and Tim O'Brien. Eugene, how did we get here?
A lot of back and forth, right? I think, what people should really understand is that Donald Trump's kind of obsession with tariffs, using them as a cudgel, did not start when he got into the political sphere. It's something he believed as a businessman. He deeply believes, when you talk to his aides, that it's a question of fairness. And now he's not just using it to try to, as an economic tool. He's also using it on to force, whether it's Canada or Mexico, to do other things, whether it comes to immigration or whatever. I will say, though, that when you talk to every economic expert, and we have some one right now on with you, is they will tell you that it is not going to be the case that the American people won't feel that pain and that pinch. That is something that everyone will say. The White House has heard that, but the president believes that at the end of the day, what his aides will say is that, one, that the folks will feel the pressure, these business people will feel the pressure of keeping the jobs here, then the prices will go down, and there's a whole cyclical aspect of it, but we've never seen it actually work out. During his first term, he did this back and forth, threatened a lot of tariffs, then moved back, threatened a lot of tariffs, then moved back. He did it already with Canada and Mexico a couple of times this year, and again now with this 50% tariff. It is very clear that the back and forth is a tussle that he likes. The White House is definitely going to say that this shows that he is a negotiator and it's the art of the deal. But I think there is also an aspect to this that the markets were going down, consumer confidence continues to stay down, that uncertainty is adding nothing to the economy. And for Donald Trump, that is how he sees himself, as the person who's going to fix the economy. It's the biggest promises he's made to the American people. And so there is public pressure and the public sentiment that also is impacting his decisions here.
There's public pressure. Republicans have heard that public pressure. They know that these tariffs are not popular. And yet, just today, in that resolution we talked about, can you pull up this headline from the New York Times? The Republicans quietly ceded the power to cancel Trump's tariffs. So it is now not clear who's supposed to hold him responsible. How long is it before Americans start to feel the impact and start to show up at even more town halls and push back?
I think there will be something of a lag, depending on where the tariffs actually land, which changes from minute to minute, obviously. So for something like steel and aluminum tariffs, those will affect the input costs of a lot of American companies. Automakers, for example, the highest share of a car by weight is steel. So they are going to pay much higher prices for their input costs, and those will at least partially get passed on to consumers, but it won't happen immediately. If we were talking about things like finished consumer goods, particularly things that are perishable, that companies could not have stored up on, so for example, avocados, tomatoes, other produce from Mexico that at some point was tariffed and now is paused, that would show up much more quickly because companies were not able to stock up in the past few months, as they did on certain things, including inputs for automobiles, among other products.
Can you explain to me what this obsession with making Canada the 51st state is?
Because it's part of Donald Trump's broader obsession with punishing his friends. It's irrational, it's unsophisticated, and it's utterly buffoonish, which is why it's embarrassing right now to be an American. Because Donald Trump, it's almost as, well, he is living in a different century. He invokes William McKinley's tariffs from the 19th century, and he lives in almost a mercantilistic world from the 16th century in which he thinks all these countries are in these separate little economic blocks. They don't need to trade with one another globally. And if anyone gets out of line, you punish them. But the perverse outcome of this right now is we're punishing our two biggest trading partners, Mexico and Canada. They are neighbors. They are excellent economic partners. We don't have a trading relationship with Mexico. We have this deeply intertwined production operation that runs up and down the supply chain with automobiles, agriculture, as Catherine pointed out, electronics, goods. And when you ask where people will feel this, think about a store like Walmart. 80% of the goods on Walmart shelves are sourced from Mexico. A third of the producers in Mexico are U.S.-owned companies. And I was in Mexico about a week ago and met with CEOs down there, and they were Mexican and American CEOs. And they were befuddled as to why Trump would run around like Yosemite Sam, shooting himself in the foot constantly, because it makes no economic sense, and it's going to hurt American consumers. It's already hurting the economy, and that's why the stock market is reacting the way it is. But Trump isn't doing it because it's economically rational.
Right, there's no strategy here.
Well, there is no strategy, but there's a goal. And the goal is personal hegemony and public hegemony for the United States through this sort of caveman window that is not how the world works in a sophisticated 21st century environment. But that's not where he's living. Right. And so he's punishing friends at the expense of Americans.